Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 255, I chat with Calibrators David Mackenzie and DeWayne Davis about their thoughts on Ultra HD. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded May 7th, 2015. Episode 255, Two Calibrators on UHD. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and editor of avsforum.com. This week, I'm pleased to welcome two guest geeks to the show, both renowned calibrators who are very familiar to the AVS forum community, and now I hope to all of you watching and listening. First up, we have David Mackenzie. Hey, David, welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, thanks. Thanks for being here. And also, DeWayne Davis is here. Hey, DeWayne, welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
Going good, thanks. Glad to have you both here. So we're going to be mostly answering questions during this show. I had put together a list of a bunch of things to talk about, and I also posted something on AVS inviting people to ask questions, and a lot of people did. So we're going to mostly stick to that, and we're also going to answer questions from the chat room. So if you have any, if you're watching at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room at irc.twit.tv, you can post questions for David and DeWayne, and I will pass along as many as I can. Let me start with one question, though, before we turn to reader and listener questions, and that is about the promise of Ultra HD. We know that it's 4 times as many pixels as regular HD, but there's a lot more to it, at least in principle and in potential. There's high dynamic range, there's wide color gamut, there's high frame rate. All of these things are possible with UHD, but they carry with them certain costs, and they're not yet standardized or finalized so that everyone is on the same page. Let me ask the two of you, which of these elements, and I asked this in a poll on AVS too, so if you haven't yet seen that poll, I would suggest you go, those of you who are watching and listening, go check that out. But to you two, which of those do you think are the most important and why? DeWayne, let's start with you.
For me, the most important and out of those categories would actually be the HDR section, and I would say probably the new wide color gamut. The resolution is dead last, to be honest with you. And the reason for that is simply with the resolution, you either have to have a very large screen, which I'm speaking of 80 inches plus, to be sitting at, your typical home distance to appreciate that resolution, or sit less than 4 feet away from a 65-inch screen or less, basically, to really, really appreciate a 4K type resolution. But with HDR, to be honest with you, I think that is phenomenal. If you've seen one properly calibrated on a display, I mean, it just is mind-boggling, to be honest with you. And that particular piece of it is visible irregardless of resolution. So there could be an HDR for 1080p, 720p, 480p, whatever. But the HDR section for me is the most important. The color gamut for the UHD spec is right now pretty much going to be the P3. That, of course, will give you more vibrant colors and a larger palette of colors, especially for the colorists to actually use to do their thing when they're actually mastering these actual movies. But for me, I think the HDR is the most important part of it, followed by the color gamut. And dead last is definitely the resolution section of it.
Yeah, gotcha. David, how about you?
Pretty much the same as that. I mean, I'm a bit of a resolution fetishist, so I absolutely I love higher resolution. But I mean, the point, like DeWayne is saying, I think, well, 1080p is already a pretty high resolution. So I'm less, I'm not upset that the resolution is being bumped, but it's not it's no longer the like unique selling point. And I think the display manufacturers are aware of the fact that higher resolution alone is not enough to push these new displays. So, I mean, in the order you asked, I believe it was HDR, wide color gamut, and higher frame rate. I mean, like DeWayne just said, high dynamic range. You can see that. It's not like your eye has your eye. You can see that from across the room. You know.
Yeah.
It's just blatant, and it's such an improvement. It's cool. Wide color gamut. That's. You know, Rec 709 I think already does a pretty good job of covering a lot of the colors in nature, the colors we can see anyway. So I mean, it makes sense. They're generally going. I understand since Rec 2020 has some other difficulties associated with it. The industry is generally going towards P3 gamut, which makes sense because we have all that content mastered for P3 anyway. You know, let's enjoy that
for the commercial cinema.
Exactly.
It's mastered for P3. P3 is a color gamut. In fact, let's show the graphic called gamuts to show the difference between the three gamuts that we've talked about. The little yellow triangle is Rec 709 or BT 709, which is what we use today, and that's what content is graded for at the studio, and it's what our TVs should be calibrated for, which these guys do for a living. The middle triangle is what's called P3, and that's the Digital Cinema Initiative color space, or color gamut, I should say, which is what we see when you go out to the movies, hopefully. That's typically what you would see. And the largest triangle is what's often called Rec 2020, or more precisely BT 2020, which is the largest one. It encompasses the widest range of colors of any of them, and a lot of people are talking about UHD being, you know, we want to get to 2020. But there are some problems with that. And let's talk about that for just a minute, because a lot of people are saying, yeah, I want to go to 2020. But, you know, it's very different experience. In fact, I have two spectra to show you real quick, and then I want to get your hit on this. One is, let's take a look at Spectrum DLP, which is the sort of, this is the spectrum of white. When you look at it, Joe Kane did this, by the way, and I thank him for this graphic. He took a spectrum of a white screen from a DLP projector, and this is the spectrum that you get. You see a peak at blue, a peak at green, and a peak at red. But there's a lot of other colors in there too. Now, if we take a look at the Spectrum 2020 graphic, it looks tremendously different. There are these just tiny little lines at each of these colors, which represent red, green, and blue. But that's what 2020 is. The red, green, and blue are what are called single wavelength primaries. So there isn't a wide range of colors. This simulation, it's really a simulation, is what would give you white on the screen. So, David, let's start with you. Have you seen many actual 2020 displays, and what was your impression of them, and what's your impression of using 2020 generally?
It's a bit of a dead-end question because, no, I've not seen a lot of 2020 displays. I know that there are some companies that are, you know, doing stuff with LCD technology that can get pretty close to covering the 2020 gamut.
Using quantum dots in the illumination. Exactly
right. If you can saturate out to that like level of green, great. But what I would really like to hear is from like a Hollywood colorists, like if they would find that wide a gamut useful. I mean, how often? I don't know how often those colors are going to appear in content. Is what I'm saying.
Good point. DeWayne, what do you think?
I'm pretty much with David, but I would also like to add that, you know, when you get all the way out to those actual points and you're dealing with that such a narrow spectra, you're going to start to deal with metamerism, which is basically where everyone sees one color different. And that's the whole point of having the wider type of spectra for the colors. When we do 2020, it's like, okay, I will see green one way, you will see green another way, David will see green in a different way. So with that, it goes back to the colors. It's like, okay, one color is going to see, the art in this format with this specific shade of color, but you give it to another one, they're going to say, nah, this doesn't look right, and I'm going to change this and that. So I don't personally think 2020 is feasible for any consumer display or actually any professional display at that. I don't see the point of it, to be honest with you. It's just far too many drawbacks and challenges as far as our visual perception to even implement it. I personally am with Joe Kane on this and say just stick with P3. It's wider.
That's the thing. We have all this content in P3 anyway. The question is, if we can do displays that can reach 2020, where is the content going to come from? I mean, it would be cool for like live events and stuff like that, but for movies that were essentially they were colored for P3. Are studios going to go back and do like a 2020 version and like push colors out when they? I mean, I really would like to hear from Hollywood in this. I mean, do filmmakers find P3 limiting already?
Good question. I will try and get a Hollywood colorist on the show to talk about exactly that point, because I'm curious as well. Okay, let's turn to some questions on AVS. Mark 12547 has a number of questions, and let's zip through them here as we can. From what you have seen, have the current crop of UHD TVs, if fed a UHD signal, provided real-world improvements over HD TVs when viewed at typical real-world viewing distances? Or is the improvement only for those who sit closer than normal to their screens? DeWayne, you mentioned this in your opening comments, and so I think you sort of answered that there, right?
Yes, I did. When you're speaking of UHD, it's not, again, just resolution. You have multiple components to the UHD. It's really a system, to be honest with you. So if fed a HDR signal that has HDR content with the PQ, which is PQ gamma, I think that will be blatantly obvious regardless of where you seat. Where you sit at. For the resolution, again, you have to be close enough or have a large enough screen to really appreciate it. So for that, from what we currently have, I would say probably not. I mean, right now, I would say the best bet is to stick with 1080p until we have a lot more true 4K resolution type content.
Right. And the other thing that you mentioned, and I think it's important to point out, is that we do not yet have very many consumer displays that are capable of reproducing high dynamic range.
Exactly.
The Samsung SUHD, which both of you have worked with as consultants to Samsung, has that capability. The Vizio reference series, which was sort of reintroduced, we first saw it at CEDIA 2014, and it was recently reintroduced in New York at a press event, but it's still not available. But when we get there, then that will be another one. But they're the only two I can think of. David,
Correct.
do you know any of any?
No, it's early days yet, and all this stuff is so
very early days. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I disagree a little with DeWayne on resolution. Like I said, I've always been more attuned to that. The thing is, it really depends on the content. Like, if you have, I mean, we are beginning to approach the kind of the zone of diminishing returns here. Like there is some like 35 millimeter film content that, or even going up to like 65 or 70 millimeter film content, you'll be able to scan it to 4K and get a nice resolution improvement. Of course, what DeWayne is saying about the size of the display is all, and how close you're sat to that is very relevant too. But really, all the early demos of this stuff have been generated with video cameras usually, or digital cinema cameras, which give a very, very, very rich, sharp image anyway. Going back to film, there are some instances where what you're really going to get from a 4K scan is like better defined film grain, which I'm all for. But it's not that alone is not necessarily going to sell it to the masses.
Scott, I would like to add one more thing on this actual thing.
Sure.
When it comes to actually getting something in HDR right now, it's very limited up until we hit, HDMI 2.0A. And the reason for that is simply you have to have metadata basically to activate it in the actual display to actually show the HDR. So it's like David said, it's still the early days. I would expect by fall basically that we'll have much more displays on the market that can do, HDR. So
we're going to have hopefully the first UHD Blu-ray displays appearing, and hopefully we're not going to have a repeat of 2006 where we're going to have some, really good content to watch on those. At least there's not going to be a format war this time around. Well, and maybe Netflix is a competitor in that, but.
Well, yeah, there won't be a format war in terms of physical discs like there was with Blu-ray and HD DVD, but I'm concerned about a format war between various high dynamic range or HDR systems. We have several now that are vying for attention. We've got Dolby Vision, we've got SMPTE has a standard called 2084. Technicolor has its own system. BBC has a system. And my question to you guys, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around, and a TV, I doubt that displays, TVs and such, are going to implement more than one of them. So if, for example, you have the Samsung SUHD, which implements the SMPTE standard of high dynamic range, what happens when it gets a Dolby Vision signal? Is it going to display high dynamic range, or is it going to not?
One thing to point out there, SMPTE 2084 is not actually a competing HDR system as such. That's the name of the paper that specifies the perceptual quantization. There's a mouthful. EOTF. It's
electro-optical transfer function, sometimes called gamma, but perhaps
it's technically not gamma anymore because gamma is so CRT centric. But I mean, when we were first talking about this, I think for the first couple of hours, I was saying PQ EOTF, and then after an hour and a half of trying that, it's just left. Let's just call it gamma. Forget it. It's easier to say. Even though it's not.
Even though it's not technically correct. Right. Okay, so you're right. 2084 is not a full HDR system. It's just the gamma, or the electro-optical transfer function, which is called PQ, originally developed by Dolby, to change how the display interprets different levels of brightness, which is different. That's basically how it is. Or if the SUHD TV gets like I still said, what if it gets a Dolby Vision signal? Is it going to know what to do with it? Is it going to ignore that extra data and just display standard dynamic range? DeWayne, what do you think?
Well, it's my understanding that all of this stuff is really just basically containers. So the TVs are actually supposed to talk with the actual source and the basically, let the source know what it can pretty much handle. And from that point forward, then the TV only displays exactly what it's handling. And it's all based on mastering. So it again, from my understanding, like the Ultra Blu-rays that are coming out later this fall, Christmas time, will actually be encoded to pretty much, it doesn't matter if it's Dolby Vision or, 2084 or whatever. They're just basically going to be containers, and it's going to be the display that, tells the actual source system, what it can handle. So I don't think on that point we are going to really have a problem. I do think it's going to be a consumer, confusion because, you're going to have Dolby Vision labels here and there, and then you're going to have another competing thing here and there. But we'll get to that point when we get there. I just don't think that from a technical perspective, I don't think it's really going to be a challenge for someone's TV who purchased one today compared to waiting, say, next year or whenever. Yes,
it's absolutely in the industry's interest to make darn well sure that this stuff, that there is not a format where that is the last thing any kind of new system needs. But I mean, the fact, like I said, the fact that SMPTE 2084, the fact that that's a SMPTE standard, that's heartening.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm not sure what Technicolor is doing specifically with their HDR, but I think the fact that everyone's at least selling in 2084 is, like I said, is heartening.
Yeah. But the good thing about all of this also is Dolby, Technicolor, and, this whole Simply 2084, they're all a part of the UHDA alliance. So that's a very good thing. That ensures that basically, there will not be any type of format war whatsoever. And, it's just basically whatever the display can handle is what the display is going to get. So, again, I just look at it as containers.
Fingers crossed. Watch this space. Yeah. Hopefully we don't. End up with a format war mess in our hands. The next Scott was going to go on. He was going to say some AVS members are concerned that HDR means painfully bright images. Are their worries justified?
No. Yes. Well, yes and no. I would say more no than yes, but I would also say that if you want the full benefits of the PQ with the HDR content, you actually have to run the display brighter than what you normally would, because if you reduce the basically the light output of the display, you actually are scaling the actual PQ itself, which of course is going to limit the actual spectral highlights and how bright they get as a whole. So
and it is like a lot of the use is going to be like specular highlights. Like in a dark scene, they're not gonna, unless the colorist really wanted to prove a point, they're not going to suddenly jack the light output up to whatever the ceiling is, be that 1,000 nits or 10,000 nits. Hopefully not, but it's going to be small localized parts of an image that are very bright, like real life, not the whole screen giving you like sun.
And not the whole actual image itself, which I see where people are getting this from who have not actually seen HDR and
thinking of torch mode displays, of standard dynamic range displays in torch mode with the backlight like ramped all the way up. But that's totally not what HDR is. That's the reason. The reason those displays look so bad is because they have SDR content, which is being displayed many times too bright, many times more brighter than CRT engineers could ever have imagined. That's one reason why that looks so terrible. HDR is not that.
And the shops who are actually selling this are not making it any better either. For instance, they're the big blue and yellow shops. Still have these things in dynamic
DeWayne,
mode.
which store is that you're talking about there?
They go by the initials of BB.
Right.
BB-8, my favorite new droid.
Yeah, it's amazing that we have HDR, which if you literally see it truly set up properly, you will never use vivid or dynamic mode ever, even in a store environment. However, they're so used to actually promoting their displays to consumers at dynamic range. They just stick it in this mode, and it just makes HDR look horrid, to be honest with you. So I've had a lot of customers come to me and say, hey, I don't like how HDR looks. I'm like, well, where did you see it? BB? Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go.
Yep, there you go. You're not going to see a good demo there at least right away until there's an education process too with BB salespeople to know what's going on, and even the store directors and managers and stuff to display these things properly.
Correct.
Right. And I mean, the whole thing with HDR, though, is that you can be, especially with the fact that now it's LCD based, you can have a picture that's bright and accurate. So like DeWayne is saying, what is the need for vivid mode anymore? I mean, the manufacturers, they should, I'd be in favor of locking it out for HDR just to, help them on their merry way.
Exactly. I agree.
Well, Brolic Beast on AVS had an interesting question here. How will high dynamic range affect the calibration process? Will there be a divide between calibrators who prefer to stick to what they know and calibrators who adopt new practices? Is it even an issue? And a related question that I was going to ask you was, do we need new tools to calibrate high dynamic range displays?
I mean, if a calibrator doesn't want to adopt new practices, they're probably not going to be a calibrator for too long. I'm sorry to add. It's like you have
Exactly.
to. I mean, unless you want to say, I just don't want to calibrate HDR displays. Okay, fine. But I mean, one of the issues that we ran into at first is this stuff is so bleeding edge. The calibration controls are not necessarily in the displays just yet. Like with the Samsung prototype displays, what we were the best we were able to do at the moment was to calibrate for Rec 709, and then the display, and it did do a very, very good job of it. The display would derive a kind of HDR mode from the Rec 709 calibration, but of course you also have a wider color gamut to deal with now, and of course the PQ gamma.
Yeah.
And I would like to add that the only reason why the Samsung displays could not, we couldn't really calibrate the PQ, the gamma section of it, or the whole HDR section of it as a whole, is simply because you need HDMI 2.01A or a manual HDR mode to actually calibrate it. And unfortunately, that display currently does not have that available. It requires metadata to activate HDR. As soon as that is available, then yes, you can calibrate for HDR. But, from our measurements, from just simply doing the 709, I mean, what Samsung has done for especially the PQ is amazing because it's dead on. For the grayscale, of course, it's actually matching what the 709 is. Plus, it's a good thing that for the UHD spec, they're still using the 709 white point anyway. So it all worked out perfectly fine. So it's limited as far as what you can do, but again, with the current limitations, there's really not that much you can really do once that actual feature becomes available to make it any better than what it is right now.
But there is also, and like DeWayne, obviously you'll be able to talk at length about this, the issue with filter-based color enhancers. Like with quantum, now we have quantum dot, which is really fueling these wider color gamuts. You'd ideally be using a spectro to calibrate all this stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And we're talking, and by the way, just for those who might not know the jargon, spectro is what's called a spectroradiometer, which is sensitive to light wavelengths across the visible spectrum, as opposed to what's called a tri-stimulus colorimeter, which is really sensitive only to specific colors of red, green, and blue, and has to be offset if you're going to be measuring a display that uses different colors of red, green, and blue. Have I got that right?
The other challenge also is that now PDP is gone, and we're waiting for OLED to really get up to speed. These initial wide color gamut displays are LCDs, and the better ones are going to be local dimming LCDs. Now the question is, what happens to the spectral characteristics of what the LEDs are putting out? The characteristics at 100% or at full illumination or 100% white could be quite different to what the characteristics are going to be when those LEDs are dimmed. And a filter-based device, it might be tricky. I mean, again, it's up in the air. We'll have to wait and see how this comes out. But
yeah, and I would like to also add that yes, you will, with the introduction of quantum dot or whatever else the manufacturer wants to relabel this actual technology. Pretty much you're going to need, if you have a filter-based meter, you will need a spectro, period, to actually build a profile for your actual filter-based meter. I mean, it's just mandatory, and it's going to be specific to a manufacturer and even specific to an actual model and or size. So if in the long run you're going to be doing this for as well, I would say for all calibrators, you need a spectro, and you need a very good one at this point. There's nothing else you're going to do. You're just going to have to, embrace change and just buy a spectro. It's absolutely necessary at this point with these new QD LED LCDs. You can't go beyond it without it.
Right. It was good practice before, and now it's pretty much essential.
Yeah, but the problem with that, of course, is that spectros are more expensive, and we're talking about very expensive pieces of equipment here.
And they're also slow as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
but I'm actually doing some testing with one of the cheaper spectros right now to see how they relate to, say, a 8,000, 10,000, 20,000 spectral, and I'm speaking of the i1 Pro 2.
Well, that's
That
new. Is that out yet?
The i1 Pro 2, yeah, it's been out for a few years now, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, okay, not so new.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, not so new, but that's going to be pretty much your cheapest spectro for an end consumer, hobbyist / enthusiast to actually purchase. But that might not even be enough for these new QD displays. You might need something that has a better resolution on it, basically, which I would think now there's what is it? There's a new spectral on the market that's roughly $6 or $7 grand.
That's the colorimetry research, I believe.
There you go. That's pretty much going to be your best bet because that's a 5 nanometer one, and that's excellent.
Yeah.
So that will be your next step up, unless someone else comes into the market with something, in between the i1 Pro and that one with a in-between price also to go with it.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I mean, going back to filter-based devices for a sec, I was at NAB in Vegas a couple of weeks ago, and I was speaking to our friends at Client Instruments. So, like, DeWayne and actually Kevin Miller as well, who isn't on the show with us today. We're all using the K10A. They are working on something. So the market is going to respond to the introduction of these quantum dot / nanocrystal displays. It's not like we're going to be without a solution.
Right. Hockey AJB on AVS is asking a question that I was going to ask anyway, which is, once we do get high dynamic range content, say on an Ultra HD Blu-ray, or it's also going to be delivered online, do you have to do 2 separate calibrations? Because you're still going to have plenty of standard dynamic range content on Blu-ray and broadcast and so on. So are you going to have to calibrate twice, once for one kind of content and once for the other? Or is there going to be some sort of auto switching going on? I know HDMI 2.0A has the ability to send a flag that says this is HDR content. Is that how the solution is going to play out?
Well, that flag is only to kick the TV into HDR mode. I mean, if I would always say yes, it's better to calibrate both separately. But currently those controls aren't there. It's easier said than done. I mean, a good comparison, and I hope I don't jinx anything here by saying this, is with 3D.
Yeah, don't jinx it. Don't jinx it.
the first gen 3D displays. I remember when I was calibrating in the US, the model would have been the Panasonic VT25. Like those first gen displays, they were sharing the same picture settings for 2D and 3D display mode. So what we had to do back then for calibrating 3D was to when we would have in 2D calibrated an ISF day mode, then an ISF night mode. What I would end up doing is repurposing the least important of the two, which for me would be the day mode, and repurposing that into a 3D calibrated mode. But then the next generation of displays, they took our feedback on board, and there were completely independent calibration memories for both 2D and 3D. Hopefully, we'll see the same with HDR now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just like to add that currently, it's going to be. I would say it's going to be manufacturer specific. Some manufacturer will actually offer, 2 unique two unique video modes, one for SDR and one for HDR. That will be the best way to do it. However, you will have some manufacturers that will choose to combine the two. I don't think the difference between, I will always be a champion of both, but I mean, I would not say that the difference between having and not having is going to be as drastic as 2D and 3D, because with 3D, you have to take into account the filters from the glasses themselves. Mm. That was the biggest thing that changed everything as far as the measurements concerned. With the HDR, it's really going to be PQ. But as long as the manufacturer is doing the actual math inside of their actual displays correctly, when it switches into HDR mode, that should be a moot point. But again, I would definitely say, yes, we need 2 unique video modes, one for HDR, one for SDR, basically. So, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Air Kitty on AVS asked a question that isn't necessarily about HDR or any of the stuff we've been talking about so far, but it is a common question, which is, if you have your TV calibrated, Air Kitty here says, I had my Panasonic 55-inch VT60 calibrated nearly 18 months ago. Should there ever be another calibration needed? Does the image degrade over time, and how fast?
Yes.
Would you like the
yes.
good news or the bad news?
Yeah, which one do you want, to be honest with you? Because
okay, David, DeWayne, you start with us.
I will say yes, you do. That's better news than what's going to come next. With that with that specific model of TV, I classify that as a high maintenance display.
Oh no!
Yeah, seriously, because it changes so much throughout its life cycle that you're probably going to need a recalibration every 1,000 to 1,500 hours, whereas with other displays, it could be 3,000 to 5,000 hours before you actually need a recal. But with any recal, it's all dependent on the time of use. It's not dependent on how many years you have it. It's actually dependent on how long you actually have it running. So the more you run it, the more recalibrations are going to be necessary. And with, like I said, with that VT60, oh yeah, you need it every 1,000 to 1,500 hours. It just shifts that badly.
Air Kitty says, sorry, David, for just a second. We watch TV daily and love it. So the concern is that the image is gradually losing its quality that I won't necessarily be aware of until it's really bad.
Well, that's the same regardless of whether a display has been calibrated or not. You know, the bad news is none of these displays last forever. They're all like degrading from the moment you turn them on.
Exactly.
But I mean, you would have to leave it a really, really, really long time without calibrating it for the image quality to be as bad as it was out of the box. That's the silver lining, really. Like if you've had your display calibrated at all, and that calibrator's done their job right, and they've turned off all the video processing nonsense we don't want, and you know the sharpness is correctly set and black level and everything is correctly set, your picture's probably going to be better than in fact almost certainly is going to be better than if it had never been calibrated in the first place.
Correct.
Now, let me ask you this. All displays need to be recalibrated, but I wonder about the difference between different display technologies. For example, do plasmas need to be calibrated more frequently than LCD TVs? And what about how do OLEDs fit into that?
It depends.
It depends. Always it depends. All right.
It really well, it does depend on the actual technology of the display and also the manufacturer involved with that specific technology. For plasmas and LED LCDs, it really is going to vary. Again, in general, for those two specific display technologies, I would say you're going to need a recal in between 1,000 and 5,000 hours. It's just depending on your actual model and manufacturer of that actual display. With OLED, OLED begins shifting from the time you turn it on until the time it dies, literally. And they actually... they do need repeated recalibrations also. I haven't really completed any long-term evaluations with the current OLEDs as far as how much do they degrade based on the hours of use. But I can say with the preliminary results, they are pretty much, they're a little better than the VT60s, but I would not classify them as being that much better. They drift a lot more than what I personally would expect them to drift. And that could just simply be, of course, with the OLEDs, they have such a limited lifespan right now anyway that it's just, they're not as stable and as, you know, other mature actual technologies that we've had for years and years now.
David, do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, like the thing that struck me with the current OLED panels is the grayscale tracking is not necessarily very linear out the box to start with, which means that you really we've ended up dialing in like the LG OLED, for example, has 20-point rather than just 10-point. They have 20-point grayscale calibration controls, which actually have not always worked correctly to start with. but the fact remains that if the grayscale, like if the natural like response, the natural grayscale tracking of the panel is not very linear, and by linear I should explain like a display that tracked grayscale in a linear way would have very similar amounts of red, green, and blue, making up the grayscale mix at 10 IRE or 10% stimulus, 20% stimulus, 30, and so on,
up to 100. Yeah.
Right, on a nonlinear display, you can have too much red at 10 or 20, and then too little red, too much blue at 70 or 80. So I mean that's kind of another wrench in the works for keeping the picture quality good. And I mean, hopefully they just get more stable as the technology improves.
DeWayne, you mentioned the limited lifespan of OLED, and certainly we know that blue OLED material tends to degrade and fail faster than the other colors. But with LG, they have this white OLED material that, well, I guess it's layers of red, green, and blue that then produce white and then go through filters again. Does that solve that problem at all, or is that problem still there?
Still there. And with the LGs, I think their lifespan from beginning to end, I think, is 20,000 hours. It's really, really small compared to like your LCDs or your plasmas. It's significantly less. It's almost like the very first gen or second gen of plasmas, where they were rated at 20,000 hours to half-life, but with the LGs, it's literally from beginning to end of life, basically. They have not solved that issue with the current crop of OLEDs. Hopefully in the future, with new manufacturing techniques for the actual light diode, the diodes themselves, that we get a better lifespan. But I would not expect, if someone buys an OLED now, don't expect it to be functional in 5 years unless you truly don't watch TV that much. I mean, I'm just being honest.
The other point, of course, is none of us are psychic. We don't know. Like that's the projected lifespan, and it's I guess you can find out with like aggressive testing to get some idea of what that display is going to look like in 5, 6, 7 years. But each one's going to be different anyway.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And we should point out that plasmas, now they're kind of gone, but LEDs are generally rated in the 60,000 hour lifespan range. So, OLEDs are now rated a third of that.
Correct.
So
that's correct.
Yeah, I think the bottom line there is that our last gen plasmas are going to last us until OLED matures.
That's correct.
We can only hope. In fact, Archon on AVS says, I have a ZT60, the last generation of Panasonic plasma. Love the picture, but he wants something in the 80+ screen size. But he's not really keen on LCDs. And he noticed on the secondhand market a few 85-inch Panasonic plasmas. These are probably in the Pro line, as I recall.
Yeah.
Will they give a better overall picture quality than from today's new LCD TVs? He's not in. Oh. And by the way, he's not interested in HDR or 4K. He's perfectly happy with standard dynamic range and 1080p.
Yeah, will it be better than LCD? I would say so. I mean, DeWayne, I think you have more experience calibrating the professional ones than I do, but the professional Panasonic plasmas, just to compare them to the consumer Panasonic plasmas for a second, they had the black level wasn't as good as the consumer line, but I think everything else, the way they were driving the panel was it a higher gradation? It's been so long since I was really into PDP for obvious reasons.
In general, with the Pro line of Panasonics compared to the consumer line, I would say for the last 2 generations, I think the Pro line was maybe 1 or 2 gens behind the consumer line. So the gradations that they have, they were not up to par with the ZT, but they're still very, very good. Now, would I get an 85-inch Pro Panasonic over a current crop LED LCD?
They both have strengths and weaknesses.
No, probably so, but it really, I would need more information on basically how that individual will be using the actual display, because, of course, with the 85-inch display, you're speaking of a lot of heat and a lot of power. So if you're living in Arizona, unless you have a excellent air conditioner, I would not buy that display. You know, if you lived in Alaska, you know, it would definitely keep you warm.
Yeah, right. That 85-inch plasma will keep you warm. Good point.
But I mean, for overall, I probably would still choose the plasma. But I mean, it's really, really tricky to give a complete answer without more information on, you know, the specifics for this user as far as how they're going to using it, the environment where it's going to be in, et cetera, et cetera. Because although, you know, plasma overall is better than LED LCDs, LED LCDs have actually progressed very, very well with the full array backlit to a point where, you know, they're impressive when you're sitting square smack in the actual center of the screen.
In the middle. Yep.
Yeah. Right. If that's what this guy is doing and he doesn't have anyone who's going to be sitting to the left and right of him, you know, then I don't know. But if he has more people sitting beside him, I would definitely sway more towards the actual plasma. But again, I just need more information to give a complete answer.
Yeah. You guys were talking earlier about high dynamic range and the level of brightness, and this was a question I was going to ask, and you guys beat me to it, about some people saying, "Oh no, it's going to be just too bright." SoCal Ray Jr. in the chat room, our friend Ray, says, I guess they did not see the Dolby HDR demo at NAB. One of those demos was painfully bright. I disagree.
Talking about the shot of the fire, the explosion? I guess every individual is going to differ. I could certainly see the statement they were going to make. Keep in mind, though, that's demo material. What they ended up finding, what's Samsung actually ended up finding with their work with, you know, UHD and everything, was that even if colorists, HDR colorists, have like 10,000 nits to play with, if they can make the image go that bright, they're going to use that sparingly, and maybe that is the reason why they don't want to burn people's retinas out. You know, it's a lot of the time I think they found that they were actually not going above, I think it was 1,200 nits.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah, right. So they weren't abusing the technology, put it that way. A demo is going to be different, though. A demo is meant to make you go, "Oh wow, look at that." So
exactly, and it's in that case, it was on the showroom floor. It was somewhat light control, but not terribly. Now they had the brightest HDR display at the show. They have their first generation HDR display, which goes up to 4,000 nits. But even that, looking at that in a dark room where they had it, I was not uncomfortable. They were showing, they were showing that shot of a very highly polished silver airplane with sun reflecting off of it. Didn't bother me a bit.
Yeah, it's going to also depend on your eyes. I mean, some people are more sensitive to light than others. So yeah, I can definitely agree and understand how Ray was saying that, you know, it was just too bright. Yeah, 4,000 nits, even with specular highlights, is bright if you're overly sensitive to light output. But another factor you have to keep in mind is the actual room environment. So if you're in a pitch black room, there is more of a possibility of eye strain compared to having this type of display in a well-lit room. So this might be a boom market for backlit
bias
manufacturers.
lighting.
Yeah, bias lighting.
Which we've talked about on the show before.
Yeah, there might be a boom time for them, you know, where they make all the money because with these type of displays, if they're doing 4,000 nits and specular highlights, oh yeah, you might want to get one if you're sensitive to light output.
Undermined in the chat room is asking, is it too much to hope that the move to HDR will also force the move to linear gamma on digital display?
Yes, it is. And the reason for that is because we talked a little bit about PQ, which is the gamma.
Definitely, and definitely not linear.
Right, it's not linear. It's linear near black, though. That's the thing. It's kind of like almost like a halfway house, and the reason it's been adopted is because at the moment we're going from 8 bits up to 10 bits, and I know that there are a lot of people who would prefer to be going way higher than that. 10 bit is what we're going to have, and essentially applying the PQ, the whole PQ stuff. That helps us. it helps us avoid contouring artifacts while using, air quotes, only 10-bit. That's right. Really what it's about. So yeah, I mean, linear would be great, but also, I mean, it's not necessarily the most efficient way of doing things for a delivery, a consumer delivery format. That isn't going to be like manipulated in like a post-production like the post-production world would do. 10 bits plus PQ. I've not been upset by the quality of the pictures I'm seeing from that. Again, I know it's not the be all and end all that people like Joe Kane would be advocating for, but it's better than what we have now. What can I say?
Yeah. I was going to ask you guys about bit depth. We have been at 8 bits for a long time. And that is basically representing the difference between the darkest, the least amount of light, and the most amount of light with an 8-bit byte, right, per color, per red, green, and blue. And now we're moving to 10. But as you said, there are those who would advocate for more. But that increases the bandwidth required and the storage capacity required by leaps and bounds. DeWayne, what is your feeling about that? Are we going to be okay with 10 bits, or are you one of those who want to advocate for more?
The more the better, of course, but I mean, I understand everyone has a budget. The thing about the 10-bit as is, we're speaking of 420 as far as the actual bit depth.
And that, by the way, is a specification of what's called color or chroma subsampling. It's a means of compressing the amount of compressing the amount of data in the color channels. Leaves the black and white channel with as much data as it can get, but it reduces the amount of data in the color channels, which gets reconstructed at the other end. And some people are also advocating for we should go beyond 420. We should go to 422 or even 444. But again, that multiplies the amount of data tremendously.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because when you talk about compressing the color channels in that way, a lot of people misunderstand, the what you correctly said is the chroma subsampling. The way manufacturers have promoted this feature, like in AVRs, they always and displays, they always mix it up, and they give the impression, they confuse people into thinking that it's associated with color gamut. It's nothing to do with the color gamut. When you see something like 444 or 422 or 420, all that means is the spatial resolution of the chroma channels, the CB and CR channels that get laid on top of the luminance. Okay, and this has been going on. This is, think of this almost as a kind of crude way, a crude form of compression. This has existed in digital video way before we had, technologies like MPEG that we're all used to today. So not only with current consumer delivery systems and professional ones, not only are we encoding the color channels at a lower resolution, we're also compressing them more. So it's actually both of those things that are going on. And the question, like, is 420 like, is that enough? Is it a big limitation? I mean, it's like DeWayne says, more is like in relation to bit depth. It's the same here. More is always better. I mean, nobody, if they were starting from scratch designing a video system now, I'm sure nobody would. Well, maybe it's wishful thinking. I'm sure nobody would advocate this now. But the reality is, I mean, maybe we'll ask the forum. When was the last time you watched a Blu-ray disc, which at the moment it's 420? When was the last time you watched a movie on BD and you looked at it and thought, "Wow, look at all that color bleed"? It doesn't really. It's. I mean, really, we're talking about. I mean, don't get me wrong. I would love to see 444. But it's down the list of requirements, I think, and that's probably why we still have 420 even today, even though we have way more sophisticated ways of reducing data now. This is stuck around, and I think the reason is because it's not that visible a compromise.
Yeah, it works pretty well.
Right. Yeah, and again, it's just purely down to how the human eye works. We're less sensitive to small color details than we are to luminance ones. So. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'd like to see it die, but let's be realistic.
Right. Yeah, we got to put our priorities here. Jab in the chat room is asking: was Samsung one of the last to manufacture the plasma, and how was its lifespan?
I think actually LG was the last.
That's correct.
I think LG was the last.
LG was the last manufacturer to produce plasmas for the North American market. I don't know how plasma's going in, in the Chinese market. I think they're still around somewhere. But for us, yes, LG was the last. As far as lifespan,
probably in the 60,000 hour range, I would guess, right?
I think they actually bumped it up to 100,000 hours. I'm not sure. I have to verify that, but it's at least 60,000 hours, which, to be honest with you, you will probably be passing that along to your grandchild before
No, every time back when PDP was current, I would always get asked, people would ask me like, "Hey, David, you work with this stuff. What kind of display should I buy?" And I would tell them one of the plasmas. And then of course they'd always buy an LCD because they were been told by the people on the showroom floor that plasmas will like eat your children and like
and you'll have to re-inject the gas after a
you'll
while.
have to re-gas it, and you'll have to refinance your house to afford the electricity bill it's going to cost you. But but the lifespan came up, and my answer was the PDP, it will last you longer than you will want to watch it for. Like by the time that thing's ready to croak, we'll have better displays.
We'll have holodecks, for God's sake.
Yeah, I know, right? We'll have airboards and the rest of that stuff.
Right. Exactly. Going back to Mark 12547 on AVS, he asked a question here, which I think we sort of skated around, but I'd like to sort of hit it right on. Are UHD TVs, do they provide better calibration controls than premium HD TVs, or at this point, are they more or less the same? I mean, David, you mentioned that the LG OLEDs, which aren't even, well, some of them are UHD, have 20-point grayscale calibration control, so that's pretty good. But any other examples?
In theory, yes, but the 20-point calibration, I think actually the ones that I've done full reviews of, the 20-point calibration controls were a real nightmare to use. And I think I believe from what I've seen and heard of the latest ones, they are making improvements in that area. So, 10 point really should do the job. 10, I would advocate, if there was a sweet spot, it'd be like 11 point, and maybe we'll see what DeWayne thinks about this. But coming out, keeping the color of gray correct when you're just coming out of black always seems to be a challenge. So at a good solution would be to have 5%, 10%, 20%, and so on.
Yeah. DeWayne, what do you think?
As of right now, I don't think they're not going to add any benefit as far as the calibration controls compared to SDR. However, I would say for future models, there is definitely an opportunity to improve the actual calibration tool set. And it's literally like what Dave was talking about. The lower end of this grayscale is linear. So I would actually advocate for, 2 steps between basically 0 and, 10 or 20% stimuli, just to make sure we get that as close as possible, unless the engineers at these manufacturers, are doing their job and actually do what they're supposed to do where that's not even needed. However, I can't speak for all manufacturers and the quality of their engineers. So it will depend on the actual panel and manufacturer. But yeah, there's an opportunity for better controls. But to be honest with you, if the engineers at the manufacturers are doing what they're paid for, to be honest with you, even the current set of controls, 10-point and all of that, is overkill. To be honest.
But honestly, like, why are we even still talking about controls at all? Like, this should be an opportunity. Maybe we should just be moving to like more of a LUT-based approach. Like, hook the probe. These TVs have got USB inputs on them, and I guess it's a cost. It's a cost versus how many people are going to use this feature. But it would be great to just be able to like hook the probe up to the TV and tell it go, and to have it calibrate its own LUT rather than having us poke away at the with the remote control and user menus.
David, I'm sorry. Before you, DeWayne, I'll get back to you in a second here. But David, explain to us what you mean by LUT.
So, like an internal lookup table. This is how it's done in post production, and a lot of the time, people, even not just in post production, people who have like Lumagen video processors will be familiar with this. Rather than just pulling up a menu and saying, okay, 10% stimulus should be a little less red and a little more blue or whatever. It's many more data points, and to facilitate that, the process is automatic. I mean, DeWayne will be able to fill you in there more, but it's like you can hook, using a PC, you can hook the probe up to the video processor and the TV, and it will adjust, 1%, 2%, 3%. It'll do a much more thorough job than a human ever could with a remote control.
Mm-hmm. DeWayne?
Yeah. Yeah, and I've been advocating for some type of calibration tool for consumers to have in displays out of the box. For a few years now, the feedback and the actual roadblocks I'm running into is basically marketing is saying that consumers are not savvy enough to use it, and that's just going to increase calls into the manufacturers with complaints about it. But with the LUTs, LUTs are great, but again, I mean, color is just math when it comes to display. If the engineers if the engineers do their job, you really won't need anything, to adjust the actual control set. To be honest with you, you don't need a CMS if they're doing their LUTs correctly and their math correctly. But recently it's just simply because I guess of smaller budgets and/or less emphasis on quality control that the requirement and necessity for a LUT box or even a 3D CMS control set has been more prevalent on displays. I currently own Pioneer Kuros, and I'm sticking with them until
until they die.
Well, until they die, but also until an actual OLED comes out that works.
Replace it, yeah. But of course, I mean, we're talking about engineers and just getting the math right, which is right. For color, that's a large part of it. But I'm talking more about like individual variances in the panel, which obviously no mathematician in the world can. Well, maybe they can, but you can't predict for that, especially like uniformity in your black. Absolutely,
but even with that. You have to deal with, how visible the errors are to the human eye. It's all in the perception also. So as I was saying with my Kuro, I mean, I can show you as many, color checker points or, checkpoints you want to in color. It's amazing what that display does with a simple 2-point grayscale and a broken CMS control set. I mean, the engineers who set this up, I mean, they were basically, I guess you can call them David geniuses because they got the math right. I guess
the question is, how many dollars or how many won or whatever do you want to throw at, and getting the delta error down from 2 to 1.
Well, yeah, right. I mean, that's the whole thing. If it's under 3, depending on which delta formula you're using, then that's where it's like, okay, what is the point? However, we're speaking of displays and technologies from manufacturers over the last at least 3 to 4 years where, out of the box, I mean, even after calibration with a 3D CMS control set, you're still getting errors over 5, and that's just unacceptable. I mean, that's just a slap in the face and a disgrace personally for me for quality controls from the engineers themselves because they're not doing their math correctly. And I get all of the variance in actual, the actual stuff that goes into the display itself. But I mean, you compensate for that. That's just, offsets, to be honest with you. It's been done, basically. If one person can do it or one manufacturer can do it, then another one can do it at that. And that's my philosophy on that. I just think we need better engineers doing this stuff.
I have to tell you that in all the displays I've calibrated for reviews primarily, I've run into the situation where more often than not, the color management system makes the whole image worse. Just makes it, it doesn't work right. So I usually leave it alone and just make sure that the grayscale is calibrated as good as it can. By the way, I just want to make sure everybody understands that when you're talking about delta errors and so on here, what we're talking about is when you're measuring a color or something on the display, there's a way to calculate the error from what it's supposed to be. And
how big a deal it is.
How big a deal is it? Right. And generally speaking, again, depending on how you calculate that error, anything below an error of 3, a delta error or delta E of 3 is generally considered not perceptible by the human eye. Again, it depends on how you calculate it. and different people do it differently. And you want to get it as low as you can, but below a certain point, it doesn't matter because you're not going to see any improvement anyway.
It also depends on like the viewing circumstances. Like if you're like calibrating those video walls like that have almost no bezel between the panels, then a delta error of 3 is going to be huge. But if you're watching a TV in isolation in your own apartment or your own home, then a delta error of 3, you have nothing to compare it to. So it's not going to stick out as much.
Yep, exactly right. One last question here from Adam Davies in the chat room. As a home user, what tools can I use to calibrate my 5-year-old Panasonic plasma? It's a VT10. And my first response is, well, I make a distinction between the word calibrate and the word setup.
Thank you.
And setup is correct.
Setup you can do at home pretty easily with something like Spears and Munsell high definition benchmark or Joe Kane's Digital Video Essentials. You can set the 5 basic controls in the picture menu: brightness, contrast, color, tint, and sharpness, and get, what would you guys say? 70–80% of the way there, probably.
Oh,
you would disagree.
It's hard to put a number on, but no, I mean, thank you for making the distinction, because a lot of people, and it's the industry's fault. It's the terminology they've been using. A lot of people will like go through like a THX optimizer and set the black level or whatever, and then think they have a calibrated display, and they absolutely do not, because like so much of calibration is like getting individual expertise, knowing what video processing stuff to turn off, where to set what, and then of course, like you say, it only in our eyes, it only really becomes calibration once you start correcting errors in grayscale and gamma and color as well.
And that's the process of calibration, which requires expensive equipment and lots of training and experience, which you guys obviously both have. But that's, if you want the full calibration, you need to hire somebody like these guys to come in and do it. Unless you're a serious hobbyist with a lot of extra money to spend on training and to spend on equipment. I want to make that distinction clear. Calibration is a significant process, and setup is pretty easy. You can do it at home, and you can get part of the way there. How much of the way there we can debate, but to get all of the way to the very best that TV can do, you need to do a full, what I call a professional calibration.
Right. So you have to read, you have to figure out what the display is already doing and then offset its errors. But the other point I'd like to add there is that, I mean, I've done calibrations in people's homes where they've either copied settings off the internet or they've done like a basic setup themselves. Calibrators, we've seen everything. A lot of the time I will go into these, I will assess the setup, and then we'll find something like their AV receiver is also mangling or affecting the picture in some way that they just wouldn't be aware of. That's another part of what calibration entails. It's not just setting up the display; it's checking out the whole video system and making sure that nothing in there is kind of sabotaging your work.
DeWayne, anything to add to that?
Yeah. As both of you guys have already stated, I mean, the setup, we can definitely debate on how much you can improve on it. But I mean, the easiest thing, regardless of manufacturer, you can do to get one of the best pictures out of the display itself is simply picking, depending on the manufacturer, what is called cinema mode or movie mode. And tweaking that specific mode. That will get you closer to what the picture would actually look like post-calibration than using any other video mode in almost every single manufacturer out there. So I would say just put it in that mode, get the AVS 709 disc off of AVS, which is free, burn it to an actual DVD or Blu-ray or whatever, and just use those controls just to set up really the black level and the light output that you wanted at, and also just tweak the color. I am not a fan of the color filters, so I don't think that will benefit you whatsoever, benefit anyone whatsoever, I should say, as far as setting up the color. I would just say either leave the color at whatever the manufacturer default is, or in most cases bump it down a couple of clicks. That will get you a better picture overall.
And what you're talking about there, just to make sure everybody understands, is that when you get one of these discs like the Spears and Munsell or the Joe Kane disc, you're going to get a little piece of plastic that's a blue filter, and you're supposed to look through it and set your color controls. But as you say, it's not really a very accurate way to do things. I agree with you. The thing to do is just basically leave the color control, which is saturation, at its default, or dial it down a click or two, and you should be fine. Well, listen, we've come to the end of a fabulous hour of conversation. I want to thank you both for being here. Tons of great information. David Mackenzie can be found at hdtvtest.co.uk. David, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It's been a very fast hour, I got to say.
It always is, man. It zips right by, zippity-doo-dah. And DeWayne Davis, also an excellent calibrator. And if anybody out there is looking for a professional calibrator in the areas where these guys are, they come most highly recommended. DeWayne's website is av-fi.com. DeWayne, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Good, good, good. You can find me, of course, at avsforum.com. And you can email me at scott@twit.tv. And you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott and also at avsforum. And you can always find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here on twit.tv/htg and also on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/twit Home Theater Geeks. Next week, I'm on vacation. So I will not be doing a Home Theater Geeks. There will be a rerun or something at this time. And I will be relaxing, which is a very good thing for me right about now. The week after that, my guest geek is scheduled to be Howard Luck, who is the chair of the SMPTE Standards Committee. And he's also the director of a really interesting documentary that will be released actually next year on the 100th anniversary of SMPTE, the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. So I'm really looking forward to talking to him in 2 weeks' time, and I do hope you will join me. Until then, geek out.